In late 1979 and early 1980, a series of awful crimes took place outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 4 people were killed. One of them was a young police officer. Some in the media called these murders the kill-for-thrill slayings because there was seemingly no motive.
Michael Travaglia and John Lesco became known as the kill-for-thrill murderers after their heinous crime spree in late 1979 and early 1980. The killing ended when some Pittsburgh police detectives quickly got hot on their trail.
Police soon found the men responsible for the slayings, John Lesco and Michael Travaglia. They confessed, and they were sentenced to the death penalty. Friends of the victims felt like this was justice, especially friends of the police officer who was killed, Leonard Miller. Killing an officer was a shocking crime, and they felt like the death penalty was justified.
Leonard Miller was genuine. He was our first Black police officer, African-American police officer.
Leonard was a real good close friend of mine. And I know I get choked up, that it hurts me to think back the day that this happened.
I mean, we cried for days and days and days.
But 40 years later, the sentence, the death penalty, still hasn't been carried out. One of Leonard's killers died of natural causes, and the other, John Lesco, is still alive. He's been waiting on death row for most of his life.
John Lesco's sentence has elapsed alongside essentially the entire modern arc of the American death penalty.
That's Mark Berman. He covers law enforcement and criminal justice for The Post. A couple of years ago, Mark started thinking about this mismatch, that there are more than 2,000 people sitting on death row in America, but only a couple of dozen people are executed a year.
And I just kept getting stuck on the idea that those numbers don't line up. At some point, a lot of these people, it seems like, are probably going to die waiting to be executed.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, December 2nd. Today, what it actually means to be sentenced to death in the United States, and how inmates and victims' loved ones have been left in a state of limbo that can stretch on indefinitely, raising fundamental questions about the American justice system. My co-host Martine Powers spoke to Mark. She's going to take it from here.
Okay, so Mark, we were talking about John Lesco's case and the fact that 40 years after his sentence, he's still alive. He has not been executed. Why is that? Why has he been on death row for decades?
Well, one of the things that happened was once he was sentenced to death, he appealed, and he filed a number of appeals over the years. His death sentence was actually thrown out, and he was given a new sentencing portion of his trial in 1995, and he was sentenced to death a second time. He has continued to appeal. He's continued to fight it. 5 different times, Pennsylvania has scheduled an execution for him. And all 5 times it has been stayed. It has been called off as he continues to appeal and to file. At the same time, Pennsylvania is not carrying out executions. The state has had a moratorium in place for almost a decade and has not actually carried out an execution since 1999.
Wow. So in basically 25 years, Pennsylvania has not executed anyone, even though folks like Lesco are supposedly like waiting for execution. Nationally, how common is that a person is on death row, but that there's no imminent plan to actually execute them?
It's very common. What we found in our reporting, and we spent a long time digging into the death row status of every state. We've spent a long time digging into the death row rosters of every state. And what we found is that more than half of people on death row today in America are in a state where executions are on hold, are paused due to an order from the governor or a court order or something else that's going on where they essentially have stopped executions for the time being.
And tell me more about why it seems that carrying out executions has just become more difficult.
One issue that has arisen in the last decade or so is that states that use lethal injection, which is the primary way executions are carried out, have struggled to obtain the drugs needed. Drug companies have said we do not want our drugs used in executions. In other states, officials have said they have concerns with the death penalty, and they have stopped executions as a result of those.
And clearly this is different from how it was in the past. Can you kind of paint a picture of how this has evolved over the last few decades in this country?
The modern American death penalty sort of began in the 1970s. The Supreme Court struck down capital punishment in the 70s and then reinstated it. After that, death row populations really just began to explode. I mean, in the 1980s and 90s, you saw death row populations double and double again. Executions became increasingly common. At one point, this country had nearly one person per day sentenced to death.
A day, wow.
And the country was carrying out an average of nearly 2 executions every week. That was at the end of the 1990s. Starting in the 2000s, there was a decline nationwide. Death sentences became increasingly less common. Executions became increasingly less common. States began abolishing the death penalty or simply stopped carrying out executions.
Well, a major decision on the death penalty in the first state.
Delaware Supreme Court decided the law is unconstitutional.
Cheers broke out as New Hampshire struck the death penalty from state law.
With a stroke of his pen, Democratic Governor Ralph Northam making Virginia the first state in the South to abolish the death penalty.
And we've reached the point where we are today, where this year is going to end with, for the 10th consecutive year, this country will have fewer than 30 executions, down from nearly 100 at the end of the 1990s.
And tell me a little bit more about that cultural shift, because it sounds like for states that had previously been carrying out executions, some of why they're doing less now is for logistical reasons. You mentioned the difficulties that they've had in getting the drugs that are necessary to perform lethal injections. But also, I think Americans writ large feel a little bit more mixed about capital punishment.
Yeah, one thing we've seen is that over the last 30 years, public support for the death penalty has declined. Gallup polling found that in the mid-1990s, about 4 in 5 Americans supported the death penalty. As of last year, that was down to a little more than 50%. It was 53%, which is still a majority of people supporting it, but far lower than it used to be. We've had a number of officials across the country sort of say, we have concerns about the fact that this is not handed down in a fair way. We have concerns about the fact that it's wasteful, that it costs a lot of money, and that they have concerns about exonerations and innocent people being put on death row. And so they've either hit pause or tried to abolish the death penalty.
So what you're describing here, to me, sounds arguably like a good development. Like if you're a person, and I guess this is, as you said, roughly half of Americans who either don't believe in capital punishment or like have concerns about capital punishment, if you're one of these people, then looking at the landscape right now, the fact that fewer people are being executed, and yes, you have 2,000 people roughly who are in death row, but it seems like many of them won't actually be executed. I mean, that seems like a positive development, like a sign that like this country has more mercy for those people. What's the problem here?
Reporting this story, I talked to a number of people who support and oppose the death penalty. People who support the death penalty say leaving all these people on death row, essentially indefinitely, is unfair and cruel to the relatives of the victims and to people who they say were promised a certain punishment, that the justice system said, we will do this, and it is not doing that. People who oppose the death penalty say leaving these people on death row indefinitely is also cruel, because they say you're leaving these people oftentimes in more restrictive conditions. They also say it's cruel to leave people essentially at the mercy of this system where, as one person put it, one day their number could just get called. If the person is on death row in a state that's not carrying out executions today, that could always change in the future election or with a future court decision. One day, the tides could turn and that person could essentially be at the mercy of a system that could suddenly begin executions again.
That's so interesting that you're hearing pushback on this, both from people who are pro-death penalty and even from people who are anti-death penalty, who say that, like, yes, these people aren't being executed, but having them remain on death row while they wait for some execution that may never come, but they're not sure that in and of itself is an act of cruelty.
I mean, one thing that was interesting in reporting the story was I talked to a number of people who support the death penalty, who oppose the death penalty. Nobody seems happy with the status quo today.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I want to come back to the case of John Lesco, who you were talking about earlier. And I know that you have been speaking with some of the friends of one of his victims, a police officer who Lesco was convicted of killing. And then you've been talking to these friends about how they have dealt with all of these scheduled executions and then executions called off and the back and forth over the last few decades. First, can you just tell me a little bit about this group of friends?
John Lesco and his co-defendant Michael Travaglio were convicted of killing 4 people. They were given the death penalty for the 4th victim, a young man named Leonard Miller, who was a 21-year-old police officer in a small borough called Apollo, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. Some of Miller's friends still struggle to this day with what they think should happen to John Lesco. Those people include William Kerr, who was the mayor of Apollo at the time.
You know, today we talk about community police officers. And Leonard did that well before the concept of police or community policing even came about. Getting out of the police car, interacting with their constituents.
I also spoke to Robin Davis and Jim Clausen, who were both police officers and friends of Leonard Miller's.
The hurt was horrible.
I remember the phone call I received that morning telling me of what took place.
And what do they remember from the night that Leonard Miller was killed?
William Kerr says he remembers vividly what happened that night. He was asleep in bed when he heard 2 gunshots and then more gunshots. He lived right across the river from where Leonard Miller was shot. And at the time, he was mayor, so he slept with a police scanner running in his room.
I immediately heard Officer Miller on the police radio. I had a scanner. And he said, 70 to control, I've been shot.
He jumped out, ran down into the family station wagon, and drove across the bridge to where Leonard Miller was.
So I knelt at his side, saying a short prayer, and I said, Leonard, who did this to you? Leonard, who did this? No response.
He died soon after, and William Kerr had to go to his parents' house to tell them what happened.
Frank and Evelyn were genuine parents, caring parents. Leonard Miller was their only son.
Oh my gosh. Right after that happened, how did William Kerr and how did the others feel about how Leonard Miller's killers should be held responsible?
I sat down with Leonard Miller's friends in William Kerr's sunroom on a rainy afternoon, and I asked them how they felt about the death sentences back then and how they feel about them today.
So I had I don't want to say a change of heart. Mm-hmm. I just thought it through. I think I'm pretty faithful, as all of you. And I came to the conclusion about 10 years ago that I would more be in favor of life sentence without parole. Just came to that conclusion. I think it's based on my Christian values, but also taking into consideration about the moratorium on the death penalty. He's going to die in jail.
Yeah.
In prison.
Yeah.
And nothing's going to change.
No.
So you would support changing it to life sentence just because you don't think they're going to do it anyway? So you think, why have this?
Yes.
Yeah. Of these 3, James Clausen is the one who is the most vocal that he still wants the execution carried out.
I still stand for the death penalty.
Yeah.
I think that it's on the books.
Mm-hmm.
It's to be carried out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a law enforcement officer that is killed.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. You don't want to put someone to death that is an innocent person.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't the case. We know the situation. We know the circumstances. We know who was guilty. Let's carry it out.
He also said he does not think he would feel any better if it were carried out.
Would that solve my problems? No. I don't think I'd feel any better.
Well, you're not a revengeful person.
No, but it's the, I don't know, closeness and the friendship that Leonard and I had. That's no longer, you know.
He said he would still have lost his friend. It wouldn't take away the pain that they suffered.
Why did that moment stick out to you?
When I was speaking to them about this, one of the things that I was the most curious about was how they feel now and how they felt then, and what would make them feel differently. If the execution happened, if they found out it never would, if it had happened years ago, if it were happening tomorrow. I thought it was notable that he feels so strongly it should be carried out, but also seems very realistic about what it would mean for him personally.
I met him through work, and I mean, he was always around. He was always helping somebody, doing something for somebody.
Robin Davis, who later became the Apollo police chief and still works in law enforcement, said her opinion also changed, in part because of the cost of this system.
Yeah. Why should we, and as I'm speaking as we, the legal system, because this continually ties up judges and lawyers and district attorneys and investigators, why should
parole board,
why should it continue to cost money in that aspect? All right? You just don't have a parole hearing for $5.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So why should we continue to be burdened with that cost? Lock them up, close the blinds, close the windows, take that key, throw it over the hill, and be done with them. Let them go.
You'd be okay with that now, just given how much time he's been fighting?
Yes.
So yeah, I heard Robin saying that she just thinks part of what has changed her thinking on this is that it's just so expensive. But I think that for an average person, like, that doesn't quite make sense. Like, why is the death penalty expensive versus the cost of, feeding and housing someone in prison for the duration of their life?
The death penalty is more expensive in two ways. First, seeking and winning a death sentence tends to cost a lot more money. Studies have found that it can cost significantly more.
Just like in legal fees?
It's also, the cases themselves are longer. A death penalty case typically is actually 2 trials in one. First, there's what's known as the guilt phase, when they decide whether or not the person is actually guilty of the crimes. If they are found guilty, they go on to what's called the penalty phase, where they determine whether or not they get a death sentence. A death penalty case can typically involve multiple experts, more work, more time. It can take a lot longer for these cases to be tried. More people are involved, so the actual cases cost more money. When people are on death row, what experts and researchers have found is when there are specially dedicated death rows, those tend to cost more money because people on death row will then be in an isolated cell, so a single cell, so they can't share a cell. There's more staffing involved, there's more people involved, there's more security involved, so it can cost more to the system. But I raised a hypothetical question with them.
Can I ask a hypothetical, which might be annoying, but if tomorrow you got a call that said the governor's lifted the moratorium, they scheduled the execution for Lesco, you would go and attend immediately?
Mm-hmm.
Just for the audio for anyone listening.
Yes.
Jim Clausen's hand went up, Robin Davis's hand went up.
Well, I would attend.
And you would support it.
Yeah.
And
I would support the decision of the parole board and the governor.
What did you make of their responses there?
I think it shows how complicated this issue is for a lot of people. I think it shows how complicated it is to live with this for so long, for people on death row and for the people impacted by some of these cases. I think it shows that it's not clear cut, it's not black and white. There's a lot of difficult feelings sort of tied up in these things.
After the break, Martine and Mark talk about the future of the death penalty. And we hear from John Lesco, who Mark visited on death row. We'll be right back.
So, Mark, I'm curious, did you ever get the chance to talk to John Lesco himself?
I did speak to John Lesco. I visited him at the prison where he's held south of Pittsburgh in Somerset, Pennsylvania. When I visited him at the prison, there are a number of requirements, including that we cannot record. I couldn't bring in my own pen and paper.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't bring in my phone. I couldn't bring in my watch. When I got there, once you go through the security screenings, you are given a notepad and a pen that you can take notes on during an interview. And when you leave, you have to give back the pen and the notepad, and you can just tear out the papers that you used.
Wow. What was it like talking to him?
One thing I thought was interesting was that John Lesco talks about his case almost as if he's discussing something happening to somebody else. He told me he has spent years behind bars studying the law. He has spent years learning about these systems. He talks about it in a sort of realistic way. He knows he could be executed. He says it would be Pennsylvania's right to do so, although he does not want it to happen. He says he knows there's a lot of emotion in these cases, but he discusses it without a lot of emotion.
I'm curious who else you talked to about this and if there were other conversations you had with people that were insightful in terms of this shifting view on capital punishment.
One of the people I spoke to for this story was a man named Timothy Geary, who prosecuted John Lesco and his co-defendant Michael Travaglia and helped get a death sentence for them back in 1982. Timothy Geary knew Leonard Miller, the victim in the case, and he was actually working as a part-time prosecutor when Leonard Miller was killed and was called out to the scene.
what was your position on the death penalty at this point in time?
I was sort of ambivalent, to be honest with you, about it. I told you I wrote a paper when I was still in college, just saying that it's too expensive. But once I saw Leonard, everything changed. I mean,
when you saw him that night, did the death penalty go through your head?
Yeah.
What was your thought?
And my thought was, whoever did this should get the death penalty.
So this standing on the side of the road by the bridge?
Yeah. Yeah. All my ambivalence went out the window at that point.
What did you make of that, of his memory of that moment of clarity that he believed in that moment that the death penalty was justified?
I think it shows how much this can be such an emotional issue for so many people, that he walked up to that scene with one perspective, and when he saw somebody he knew on the ground dead, his feelings changed in an instant.
What did he say about how his thoughts on this have evolved?
I asked him how he felt about this and how much time had passed and whether his opinions on it had shifted.
It was the tide coming in on the beach over and over, you know. It wearing down the rocks on the beach. And that's what it was. And I started realizing, you know, when after 20 years or so have gone by, you're thinking, what's the point now? You know.
Mark, I thought I was curious. You said earlier that you've talked to so many people about this issue, people who are passionately pro-capital punishment, people who are advocating against it, and that across the spectrum, even from both sides, that like everybody is dissatisfied with the system as it currently stands. Then what's the solution here? Like, what are people proposing should change that would veer us away from this, what seems like this kind of limbo of states that have the death penalty but don't really use it anymore, but people are still on death row, and then it's just sort of this muddy middle ground?
There are two perspectives on that. People who support the death penalty say the way out of this is to start carrying out executions again. Louisiana's governor, who took office this year, who is a vocal death penalty supporter, quickly signed a bill adding new execution methods in a way to speed up and resume executions. People who oppose the death penalty have said that the solution here is to just remove these people from death row, acknowledge that they will not be executed, and remove the possibility. They have asked some outgoing officials, including North Carolina's governor and President Biden, to commute death sentences on their way out the door to make sure that their successors cannot resume executions at some point down the line.
President-elect Trump has said in the past that he is a supporter of capital punishment. The fact that he will be president starting next year, do we anticipate that there will be any changes in federal death penalty law and that might kind of shake things up here?
President-elect Trump has not specifically said whether his administration will resume executions, but it is expected that it likely will. When he was in office the last time, his administration resumed federal executions for the first time in almost 2 decades, and during his last year in office carried out 13 executions. Then President Biden took office, and his attorney general pretty quickly said, we have a moratorium in place, no more executions. President-elect Trump has not officially said what he intends to do, but observers expect his administration would seek to resume executions.
So where do things go from here? And what are the questions that you have about how this very complicated issue is going to play out going forward?
I talked to some people who support and oppose the death penalty who said they just don't see any change coming. They don't see any big push to commute a number of sentences all at once. And barring that, it seems like the status quo will remain. It just raises these questions, right? It raises questions about what is justice in America? How do you define it? Who defines it? Is it seeking these sentences that'll never be carried out? Is it not carrying them out? Is it commuting these sentences? Is it just leaving these things in limbo? Because at the moment, it seems like people are just left wondering what's going to happen.
Mark, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Mark Berman covers law enforcement and criminal justice for The Post. He spoke with my co-host, Martine Powers. Before I go, I wanted to share 2 more stories with you. First, the White House is defending President Biden's decision to issue a full and unconditional pardon for his son, Hunter. Talking to reporters aboard Air Force One on Monday, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre denied that Biden misled the public. This is after Biden repeatedly asserted he would not pardon Hunter. Hunter was found guilty of gun-related charges in Delaware and pleaded guilty to tax evasion in California. Here's what Jean-Pierre told reporters on Air Force One.
2 things could be true. The president does believe in the justice system and the Department of Justice. And he also believes that his son was singled out politically. And this is what we saw over and over and over again over the last couple of years.
Jean-Pierre also told reporters that there'd be more pardons from Biden before he leaves office next month. And the earliest known country music recording has been found. That's the voice of New Orleans singer Louis Vasnier, performing Thompson's Old Gray Mule in 1891. That's 133 years ago. This music was found after a collector paid about $100 for a box of wax cylinders at an auction in Pennsylvania coal country. These cylinders are the oldest commercial medium of recorded music, and they sat in the collector's house for years until he decided to put one of the decaying brown tubes onto his custom player. Vasnier's recording is the oldest country music recording ever found. And it's notable because he's a Black singer, and the industry has long overlooked Black artists. An independent label, Arcaphone Records, re-released the song last month. Arcaphone specializes in these old recordings. Label co-founder Rich Martin wants to revisit the complicated relationship country music has had with race. Here's what he told my colleague Jeff Edgers.
Black artists, by and large, who were the ones who performed and recorded that stuff, get wiped out of the picture because they say, well, it's not really country. So ours is partly a project of reclamation.
The song Thompson's Old Gray Mule was later recorded by hillbilly masters, Uncle Dave Macon and Riley Puckett. But we'll let that first version from Vasnier play us out today. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick, with help from Sabby Robinson and Rennie Svirnovsky. It was mixed by Justin Garish and edited by Maggie Penman with help from Monica Campbell. Thanks to Efrain Hernandez Jr. and Rishma Kirpalani. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.